Now, before we get into the story of Abbey Road, I got to give a little bibliographical credit here. I read a heck of a lot about this album, as I'm sure you all did. I've been reading about it most of my life, but I pulled this week a heck of a lot of tracking details and timelines from the admirably exhaustive and entertaining research of a guy called Scott Fryman, who has this great lecture series called Deconstructing the Beatles. So,
Oh, wow.
cool series. He's giving it as a lecture series, audiovisual tidbits, pictures, recordings, ISO tracks. Anyway, definitely recommend checking that out. Yeah, I think he does every single Beatles record separately
Damn.
over the course of 2 hours each, and he did 2 separate ones for Abbey Road. But he's just compiled a lot of this research, so I want to give him credit before we start. Okay, I thought we got so many Beatles records to get through as this podcast continues, but I'm just going to give you a 30-second history for anyone who might be unfamiliar with the bare bones basics of the Beatles story. Beatles are from Liverpool, England. They get their start playing clubs, doing early rock and roll covers in the early 60s, multiple hours a night, multiple sets a night, multiple shows a week. They're playing around Liverpool, and at some point they spend a long time playing in Hamburg, Germany. They get very tight as a band. That's where the 10,000 hours things comes from. And in fact, in that Malcolm Gladwell book, where the 10,000 hours concept was coined, it takes 10,000 hours to get to expertise, he cites the Beatles very directly. They become a worldwide phenomenon around 1964, tour the world to screaming fans. But something really interesting happens after that is they get tired of the road. They get annoyed by the live sound capabilities of the day. And at the same time, they're writing and recording more and more complex arrangements for their songs. So they retire from playing live shows and become studio nerds, releasing several very high selling, very well received albums through the mid 60s. There's 4 songwriters in this band. They're all, well, 3.5 maybe. They're all fairly experimental and wanting to embrace different sounds and different recording technologies. And then there's this older, wiser producer, George Martin, who's helping them execute on their ideas. We've already kind of alluded to all of that, right? The experimentalism reaches, I think, a peak on the White Album, which is actually a self-titled album released in November of 1968. And this is kind of where our story for Abbey Road and the eventual dissolution of the Beatles jumps off. So the White Album sessions had been full of arguing. It was very contentious. At one point, Ringo quit the band and left for a while.
He's the chillest one, too.
Yeah, he is the chillest one. He was probably, and I was surprised to learn that Ringo was actually the first one, I think, who officially quit the band and left. And as you're going to see, because then, so flash forward a little bit to early 1969, which is covered in that Get Back documentary, and it's also covered on our episode number 38 entitled Let It Be, where they attempted to sort of shake off the animosity and tension of the White Album sessions and get back to their roots, play rock and roll music, right? It culminated in that rooftop concert in London on January 30th, 1969. Now, so we covered that in a previous episode. Go check that out in the back catalog. It resulted in the album Let It Be. Now, while those sessions were later cobbled together to form that album, the Beatles' last official release, which happens more than a year after the sessions, like May of 1970 is when the Let It Be album comes out. The recording for this album, Abbey Road, took place after those sessions, despite being released earlier. So it's a little odd, but so we're really talking about the end of the Beatles' recording career when we talk about Abbey Road, even though technically Let It Be was released after. Okay, so keep in mind, this is after all the stuff we talked about on episode 38. And again, go listen to it. We did a deep dive. Peter Jackson in that documentary did a deep dive. We got to watch the Beatles practice, create these songs. This is after all that stuff about John and Yoko sitting side by side at every second of every practice, literally touching at all times while the band is trying to rehearse songs. George, during those sessions, quits the band. They have to convince him to come back. And at this point, they were kind of like, people quit, they come back, like, whatever, it happens, right? You can see maybe how that came around. And like I said, the famous rooftop concert. All that stuff happens in early 1969. And then after that, they get back together for one more and they decide to make this album. And, the reason that it came out after Abbey Road, I should just say, I don't think this came up on the other one, is that they were so disillusioned by those sessions in a way. Didn't really turn out the way they wanted. They left it to an engineer, this guy Glenn Johns, to try to craft this album for them. And he was he was left with all this tape, and he kept trying to pull together a track list that they would approve. And, it took a long time, basically. What they really wanted, I think, out of those sessions, and they did eventually get, right, and we're building up to Abbey Road here, they wanted a movie version. That's why they were shooting that documentary footage. They wanted to showcase them playing on that rooftop. They wanted to showcase them getting back to their rock and roll roots. Ultimately, that came out. It didn't really show them in a great light. It kind of showed them fighting and sniping, and it was subsequently buried, I think, primarily by Paul McCartney, who felt like he didn't come off very well, and that's why years and years later we got the Peter Jackson documentary, Get Back.
Rob, I have a question on that, or maybe an observation.
Sure.
They had done many movies before.
Yes.
Yellow Submarine, Hard Day's Night. They were a visual band. They were kind of doing a proto MTV sort of visual aspect to the band. Do you have any indication that they were trying to be maybe a little bit more serious and be taken a little bit more seriously with the Get Back, or a sessions recording process, and wanting to put out a movie where they weren't a bunch of goofballs running around and it was like,
it's possible.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know for sure, but I do have another tidbit that can kind of add to that. I think it would be reasonable to say that A, this was their first documentary feature, and that B, yeah, they had matured. They felt like they had grown, and in many ways they had grown apart. They were interested in different things, right? Like as young men do. They're all like 26, 27 at this point, by the way, which is insanely young. But I wanted to point out, speaking of being taken seriously, I wanted to point out that at this point they were already planning and had talked about and had reached out to directors about their next movie project, which was an adaptation of a famous British trilogy. Can you guess?
Is it The Lord of the Rings?
It's The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Now, listen, if you guys didn't read about this, I want you to attempt, because they cast it already in their minds. The four of them into roles in Lord of the Rings. So if you already read about this, it doesn't count. But I want to hear you tell me what roles they should play in Lord of the Rings.
Ringo has to be Pippin. That's the only one I got. Ringo is Pippin.
Close, pretty close.
Is he married? Is he married?
No. So not all hobbits are represented in this cast list. Only 2 hobbits are represented in this cast list. So try again with that in mind.
John Gandalf?
No. George wanted to be Gandalf.
George wanted to be Gandalf.
That's a good Gandalf.
Yeah. Paul, I'm sure, wanted to be Frodo, right?
Paul is Frodo.
Yeah, of course.
Ringo is, of course, Sam.
Yeah.
And that leaves one more. Any thoughts?
John was Samaron.
Gollum?
John is Gollum.
Oh, good lord.
They even
approached heroin out at the time.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, so he's pretty bad on the heroin by now.
And obviously didn't get too far, but they had serious talks about it. They approached Stanley Kubrick about making it. Obviously nothing really happened. Okay.
Wow.
And Yoko was the ring that needed to be destroyed.
Thrown into a
Or the chick from the ring.
Wow.
You
Too perfect. That's great. So this is kind of where our story picks up. It's after those Get Back sessions, which were in January of 1969, and maybe didn't go quite as they wanted. It did result in that rooftop concert, the last performance. So pick it up again in February, late February. They take a couple weeks off, right? And they end up working on some stuff again with Billy Preston, who was in the Get Back sessions at Trident Studios. They actually had a couple more sessions kind of over that spring, which we'll talk about, but it kind of seemed to me like they were still just in automatic mode, which is that they recorded whenever they could, released singles whenever they were done, not necessarily thinking about another album just yet. And we have to remember that they were in the business of releasing singles separately from albums. So, not everything was destined for an album. If they liked the song, if they felt like it had single potential, they kind of just went in, banged it out, and got it out the door. But the Beatles are a little bit scattered to the winds. Ringo is trying to work on his film career. George is obviously still a little miffed. He's not being taken seriously enough as a songwriter. They're having a little, McCartney, unsurprisingly perhaps, is trying to hold the band together. So he comes up with this idea, let's do it the way we used to do. And Paul McCartney reaches out to George Martin. And George Martin, he wants to work with George Martin again. That's part of it. And he wants to get back. It's ironic because the last sessions were called Get Back, which I think was referring to more old rock and roll and live band energy. But that went awry. He was like, let's go do what the last thing that worked, like the Sgt. Pepper days or the Revolver days. He reached out to George Martin. George Martin says, I'll do it. I'll work with you guys. again. I'll be that same person I've been, but I have a couple requests. We have to go back to Abbey Road, and we have to go back like that. That's the place where we're the most comfortable. That's the place where you guys sound
The
the best.
giant warehouse from the
Twickenham.
session,
Yeah.
was that right? It was not not optimal.
And listen, Martin takes some convincing, because they kind of strayed away from Martin for some of those. I don't know if he's in the Get Back sessions at all. Recall that Phil Spector ended up being credited as a producer on that final album. They're working with a variety of people, but I think the issue was that Martin kind of was disillusioned by those White Album sessions where they're fighting constantly and sniping at each other. And he's like, Paul, I'm not doing it unless the fighting's over. And Paul's doing that thing where he's like, no, George Martin's in. And then even though he's not in, it's John, he's trying to like play all sides a little bit, right? He's like, Paul, are you guys sure you're all on board? Paul's like, yes. George Martin's like, even John? Paul's like, yeah, he's in.
Totally. Yeah.
All right. So he makes another demand too, which is you got to give him control. We got to do it at Abbey Road Studios, which interestingly, his other demand is you got to give me control. I want control back, right? I'm the guy that made you famous. I'm the guy that can help produce this record. If we're going to do it again, I got to be in control. And we got to do it at EMI. And we got to bring back the engineer that we used on some of those old great projects that you guys fell out with also during the White Album sessions. His name is Jeff Emmerich. He engineered Revolver, part of the White Album, part of Sgt. Pepper. It's like, we got to do all of it, and we got to do it at EMI. Anyone notice anything weird there?
EMI and Abbey Road are different places.
Abbey Road Studios was called EMI back then.
Okay.
And in fact, dating
Really?
back to the 1930s when it opened. Only in 1976 did they rebrand it as Abbey Road Studios to capitalize on the Beatles' fame.
No
Get the fuck outta
way.
here.
Yeah,
Wow.
Would
interesting.
they say we have to go back to Abbey Road because it was the studio on Abbey Road? Like, is that how it came about, or no?
That's a really good question. They might have thought about it that way, because we're going to get into the naming and the cover a little later, but it was definitely called EMI Studios. And EMI had been their home for so long. They had a lot of technological advantages, and it was a much more enclosed space that they liked. So I thought that was an interesting tidbit. I did not know that they smartly rebranded the studio after the Beatles broke up by a few years. Oh yeah, here's another side note I found when I was digging into what happened at EMI and some of the things that were pioneered there through the influence of the Beatles. So the head engineer at this studio, Abbey Road, aka EMI Studios, he created a technique called artificial double tracking, or ADT. I can't believe we've never talked about this before, and I didn't even know it existed, but it was created specifically because John was complaining about always having to double track his lead vocals back in like 1966. So to solve this problem, this head engineer at the place, Townsend, made use of the fact that the 4-track tape machine they were working with had 2 outputs on each track, and they were about 1.5 inches apart in tape length. And he realized that by taking the sync output from the 4-track and recording it onto a second tape machine, then the 2 replay outputs would be fairly close time-wise, and it gave this sort of perfect double tracking where you could actually control the time difference by hand. You could move the second voice before the first voice. You could move it after. You could even get kind of a phase effect by adjusting. I'm not saying I understand every piece of this, but this was pioneered at this studio for the Beatles.
Wow.
So this is like natural tape delay based upon the fact that it has to travel a further distance to get to the second head
Correct.
from the first head. And so
And by
that's what
doing
gives it
that,
natural,
and it's very subtle, and because we talked about double tracking before, there's this natural effect when you just decide to sing the exact same thing a second time, even if you're hitting all the right pitches and the same cadence and the same words, there's little variations that create a chorus effect sound. So you can get that this way too.
Yeah.
And you're talking, it's not really delay, right? You're talking like a 50th of a second versus a quarter of a second, which might be considered delay, right? The double track is, just a hair.
Yeah. You'll start experiencing a whole bunch of interesting sort of EQ and phasing effects, like Rob said. Like when it gets really close, you get all kinds of weird cancellation.
Yeah. Well, music is a wave, right? Sound is a wave.
totally.
And so those waves, when they're perfectly aligned, you move them just a little bit and then they start intersecting at weird points and giving little interesting touches to it. So that's very cool.
Especially something like this that isn't like hard synced to a, like an electrical.
Yeah,
metronome.
it's analog. It's not digital. Yeah,
So-
digital perfection there. Yeah.
So I was personally a little. Oh, go ahead. Adam.
I read something else as well, just about some more of the kind of technological innovations in the studio, in the EMI studio for this album, was that they rigged up closed circuit television for the orchestra room, which I think was Studio One at EMI. It was a giant studio, but they rigged up, well, microphones, obviously, but closed circuit television so that they could see each other and communicate as the orchestras and take real time feedback
Interesting.
to and from the booth into the actual orchestra recording room.
Yeah.
I think that part of the reason they did that, so I bring it up because I'm surprised because we have talked about double tracking a lot. Even John Lennon's double tracking, which he does pretty consistently. I did not know about this technique, nor have I personally used it. But it is an example of the Beatles helping to change and modify and evolve recording technology in this really cool way. But okay, back to Adam's thing, right? About the closed circuit television and how the control room communicates with the tracking room. I think, a little speculative, but I'm pretty sure that the reason they would have done that, here's another more nerdery from the EMI studio, is they had recently upgraded the technology. Now, they were still on an 8-track machine, but this is the very first time the Beatles had recorded on a brand new mixing console in the studio that had 24 inputs and 24 faders. The previous machines, they're all still 8 tracks of individual isolation capability. But the old machine, just how you controlled it, only had 4 faders and 4 inputs. So it really limited like what you could do and how you could do it. So basically a single track now could be routed to multiple channels, give them a lot more control and options. It was also the first mixer that had built-in compressors and limiters on each channel, like full EQ controls on each channel and full stereo panning on each channel.
Those are huge technological breakthroughs.
All that stuff is stuff we take absolutely for granted on a mixing console right now.
1,000,000%. And by the way, listeners, if you are listening to us right now, we have EQ and compression on these tracks. And if we took it off, it would sound terrible. It would sound really bad. You have no idea how much that does just for the overall richness of the sound.
And if you go all the way back to the first episodes, we tried hard panning, but then we decided that was a bad idea. But okay. Chagrin. I'm trying to bring it home to Adam's point about the closed circuit television so that they could talk, because one of the interesting things about this new mixing console is it was way bigger and the room was only so big. And so if you can picture it in your mind, there was a window between the control room that was up above by a floor and the tracking room. And there was a window there. And in the old mixing console setup, you could be sitting at the mixer and staring down and making some eye contact. And maybe you had to stand up or something to communicate, but you could do that. But with this new mixing console, the room wasn't big enough. They had to change the orientation of the control room entirely and switch it to the other way. And so I think that might have been one of the things that made them want to create a better solution because now the engineer can't even see what's going on in the tracking room.
Right.
Well, and I have had experience, actually all of us on this call have had experience not that long ago with a control room on the second floor where you can't see the engineer, and you just get this, in our case, incredibly pissy and dickish voice in your ear going, can you do that again? And it's so much better if you got the engineer and you can look at him. There's facial cues going on as opposed to just this sound pumps into your ear. Goes.
I think I realized in that experience that seeing the facial cues was probably for the best. Not saying that, rather.
So the point of all this is that this record, if you've ever thought, hey, this really sounds different than other Beatles record, it really is, because it's the only Beatles record that was recorded on a console like this, which is much more of a modern console. Okay.
Well, and I think that's one of the, going back to some of the like criticisms that I saw, like the sort of, at the time reviews, there was a lot of people seemed to have like a problem with the fact that it sounded a bit over engineered, or that, I don't know if people just weren't kind of ready for a sound that was that drastically different, or that was utilizing that many sort of tricks in the studio. But it seemed like something that was a net positive people really had like some issues with at the time.
So Rob, you said it had 24 faders, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Instead of 4.
And they're going from a 4-track to an 8-track tape machine, or were they on 8 tracks before?
They were on 8 tracks before, because the size of the tape did not change.
Sure. Yeah. So It really is the difference between being able to run a maximum of 4 microphones into one track versus being able to run 24 microphones into
Yeah.
one track.
I
Right
feel
now,
you. Right.
Which-
you know,
right.
like
Which a clear artifact of that is Ringo's drums are recorded in stereo for the first time.
Yep.
yeah, totally.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay.
And especially if you're committing to something like stereo, you know, based up the middle, like you can just burn 2 tracks on that, you know, and against
Yeah.
with EQ, which you have now.
You still have this
Very
challenge of
different
the 8
tool.
tracks, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it with the songs, where they keep having to free up more tracks for, say, the orchestra. They have to kind of bounce it down to another tape and commit the vocals and the guitar to a single track and kind of commit how they're balanced together earlier than maybe you would like to. In the modern era, you have this as many tracks as you could ever want, and you get all the options all the way till the final stage. But yes, it's a huge improvement that cannot be ignored.
I've always thought that we have experience, Rob, you and I, recording where we were recording directly to tape on an old board. It was all analog, and we are like, yeah, this is great. We're going to do it how the Beatles did it. And it's like, no, the Beatles were trying to use all technology available. If the Beatles were making something right now, they would not be like analog, all on this shitty old board from 1965. They'd be like, no, give me a million
Tools,
digital
right.
tracks and I will layer everything I possibly can.
But you know what? But that said, and I'm sure it'll come up again on the songs, they were into the idea of playing as much live as possible and singing as much live as possible, which I think something, including in our recordings, we've gotten a little bit away from that. And I see the value in that, right? Even though they had a lot of overdub capabilities, they still usually would be willing to switch instruments to try to get as big of a live take as possible, as many tracks taken care of as possible.
Well, which I think makes sense because I almost couldn't imagine these songs live, and at least at the time, right? Because I mean, they weren't playing shows at that point, and so I don't know if it was just to keep that spirit alive of the live kind of feel, but I think it works really well in replicating that. And yeah, they weren't road testing any of this stuff, so you know, who knows how it would have actually sounded at a show.
So speaking of overdubbing and playing things live, you know, we're in the early part of 1969. People are kind of off on vacations with their wives. The band kind of splits for a while after the Let It Be sessions. And Paul's around London for a couple sessions, right? But during this time, John and Yoko get married. They pop around Europe. They do the bed in for a week for peace. Paul also gets married to Linda at this point. Ringo, like I said, goes off and makes a movie. They've been in a band, a hugely successful band, for 7 years now. It's been intense.
I think that one of the most important things in that entire scenario, George was working that entire time. George was like helping other people produce albums. He was writing music. George was stepping up his game during that time. And I feel like the other guys were like, we're going to take a step back from it. And George was kind of head down, like, I'm going to work on some shit.
He was coming up as a songwriter. And yeah, there's a story about how in the end of February, he goes into the studio on his birthday, on his like 26th birthday. And he's like, as a treat, I'm going to work just on 3 of my songs, and gets them more ready. And I think one of them is Something that he works on and gets it into a better demo stage to bring to the group. I think there's a couple reasons it's hard for him, and we could dive more into it as it goes. One, he doesn't have a songwriting partner to bounce things off of, although you could argue Lennon and McCartney aren't doing so well at this point. So he kind of needs to put in more solo work to get the songs to the level where they need to be. And I think that kind of shows here. But I wanted to mention on the overdubbing tip that Paul is just kind of keeping it alive however he can with whoever's around. And John has this whole experience trying to get married, trying to find someone that will marry him and Yoko. They bop all around Europe. They get married in Gibraltar, right, which is a British protectorate or colony or whatever. And then they come back to Britain and they're welcomed back. And right as soon as that happens, John wants to turn his marriage and subsequent travels into a single. So he and Paul head into the studio in April, and just those two record the Ballad of John and Yoko. It's 100% those two. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I didn't know that. It's a fun song. They did release it as a single. But who knew that it was only 2 of them, right?
So you're saying Paul is on drums?
Paul's on drums.
Well, it's
I
that
definitely
old
didn't know that.
old quote of, is Ringo the best drummer in the world? Ringo's not even the best drummer in the Beatles. Like, Paul does a
fuck
pretty damn
that.
good job on that.
That's
That's not an
nonsense.
accurate statement.
I
I know
know.
it's a pissy rejoinder to a reporter's question. Probably more of a boosh at the reporter than a boosh at Ringo, but either way.
But it is a theme here that I think we're going to keep revisiting. I'm even newly surprised at how fluidly they're able to switch instruments with John on piano and Paul on guitar and all this kind of stuff. So we'll get into it. Okay, so the situation's kind of this, right? When the boys stick to music, it goes great. They spend the next 3 weeks in and out of the studio. This is around April. They work a little bit on Octopus's Garden. They work on a super long jammy version of something with Billy Preston. They work on Oh Darling. But unfortunately, whenever they start to talk business, they fight. And so to round out our story for side one, I wanted to take a little detour into the business of the Beatles. So way, way back, Brian Epstein, their manager in the early days of the Beatles and until his untimely death, had offered the Beatles publishing rights to a television producer in order to get the Beatles featured on this UK show called Thank Your Lucky Stars. That guy's name was Dick James, and he basically created a contract that gave himself a majority share in those publishing rights. And Brian Epstein, he was more of a friend of the band and not super savvy. He didn't see the implications of the contract, and he signed it. Now, flash forward to the late 60s. The Beatles are huge. Brian Epstein has passed away. That's part of why they're fighting. I think he was a, let's say, sixth member in the background, helping remind them of that they were all friends. And he passed away right before the White Album got made. And, that was a huge bummer for them, obviously. He's gone. Beatles Corp is really not doing so great, despite the amazing artistic success of the band. Apple Records, which they've founded, is also being completely mismanaged, despite their first initial release. This is the record company that they founded, but it turns out you can't make great art and also run a successful music business simultaneously. It doesn't work. And that's even though the first thing that Apple Records released was the massively successful hit, Hey Jude. So by early 1969, John makes a comment to the press saying something to the effect of, the Beatles would be broke in 6 months if things continued as they were. Okay, well, guess who hears that quote? It's Alan Klein, a guy who managed Sam Cooke. He managed the Stones. He had been kind of lurking around the Beatles' orbit for a while. He had actually offered to buy out their RCA contract, but a couple years before, but Epstein had turned him down. He steps in with an offer to help clean things up. Now, side note, Paul absolutely thought this dude was a shyster from the beginning and warned his bandmates, but the group overruled them. He became their manager. Spoiler alert, Paul was 100% right. We'll get to that. But to be fair to the other Beatles, it probably didn't help that Paul was advocating for his new father-in-law, Linda Eastman's father and brother, to manage the band instead. That was what he wanted to happen.
See, now that would go off worse than the shyster. If I were in the band, it'd be like, I'd rather have this obvious con artist than your fucking nepotism.
Right.
They can
roll the
both be
dice on a
wrong.
con artist. Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Good to know.
So, okay. So this is it's a little side tangent, but I think it's important context. So Alan Klein comes in. He's kind of trying to hold the band together in part so that he can have them re-sign a lucrative deal at the record company while rumors of their impending breakup swirl in the press. And he actually does this successfully. And I think we covered it in the Get Back, Let It Be episode, but every band member, he becomes the band's manager through democratic vote, and he becomes the manager of each individual Beatle, save Paul. But in any case, this guy Dick James, the old television producer who's been kind of paying attention from the wings, he sees that Alan Klein is going to quickly figure out his shenanigans and instigate some kind of legal proceeding against him or do something. So he very quickly sells off Northern Songs, the publishing company, to a company called ATV without any input from the Beatles, without bothering to offer them a buyout, nothing, or offering for them to buy it. This all happens the day before. This is happening in 1969. So it's kind of just like bad vibes. It kind of gets swept out from under them, partially because they can't agree fast enough on a guy like Alan Klein, and partially because this guy is just not a good guy. Now, the catalog for publishing wouldn't go up on sale again until 1986, at which time, because Paul and Yoko absolutely still could not agree, guess who bought it?
Michael
Jackson.
Jackson.
Jackson, yeah.
Michael Jackson. That's correct.
Yeah.
It's just business, Paul. But that brings us to our favorite segment
I
here
don't believe it.
on the podcast. Let's do Abbey Road by the numbers. First number I want to throw out to you is 6, as in cents, 6 cents. The royalties that the Beatles made between 1962 and 1966 on every record sold. That's not a lot. They were pretty big at that
Those
time.
are TLC numbers, man. That's
Right.
Wow.
Now, luckily,
Where was their money
Brian,
coming from?
touring, I guess, to a certain extent, the movies, right? Merch. They were selling everything with Beatles faces on it. So I think that's where the money came from.
I'm
But
just
it was
picturing like Ringo being the one that has to man the merch table at the shows while they're out.
right.
Would you like my lunchbox?
So they did a little better as time went on. Brian Epstein, during the 1966 to kind of 1969 period, negotiated them 39 cents per record sold. And when Alan Klein came in, he did get them a better deal at 57 cents that lasted in through the 70s. Okay. Next number I want to throw out to you. 3. We're going to keep the number small today. 3. That's the number of takes / performances that were patched together to make the final cut of I Want You. So after all that praise we heaped on them for doing everything live, in fact, they Frankenstein the shit out of whatever they want to. So listen, they're just like me and you. It's a bit convoluted, but they worked on this one back in February at Trident Studios, a whole different studio. They Frankenstein together 3 takes into a single version of the tune then. And then later in April, they bounced all that down and started calling it Take 1 just to be extra confusing and added more stuff to it. But then even later after that, they go back and add some other Frankenstein tape from those original sessions and add synthesizer to it. So it's a composite, and I tell you that so you can feel better about the magic of modern digital editing and how freaking hard it is to keep your files in order. Thank you for listening to our show. We love you. The numbers go up every week. And I just wanted to say thank you to all our listeners. And particularly, you guys probably know this by now, we tape these a little ahead of time. And so we're still kind of getting the news in. But the response to the Patreon and our new show, Song Battle, of which we have just launched, we've just scheduled another edition of Best of the 1980s. We're really excited. Thank you so much for subscribing to that, for checking that out. We hope you like it, and we just appreciate everything you do, and even just listening to our free show every week. We put a lot of work and love into this, and we feel the love back from you guys. So thank you.
And occasionally some serious hate mail, which I believe we read on maybe the last episode, which, yeah, I love that.
I transmogrify that into love, Tom, thankfully.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I live off of spite.
All right, we're getting to the songs now, I promise. So May 6th, they work on the song You Never Give Me Your Money. It's sung by Paul, and it is a reference to their financial troubles with Alan Klein. They have a blowout argument at that point, and the album stalls. They scatter to the winds. They all take vacation with their wives. Lennon and Yoko go off and record Give Peace a Chance, which is the first song credited to the Plastic Ono band, and technically the first solo project released by a Beatle. It's initially credited to McCartney Lennon, even though McCartney has nothing to do with it, but I think that's changed later. And they take some time off. Long story short, but in July, they all recommit to making the record together. We're going to pick it up again next week and talk about the Abbey Road sessions. But for now, let's dive in to the songs on side 1.